Welcome, luxury enthusiasts, to the Luxury Travelers Podcast, hosted by Rodney George. The ultimate passport to opulent destinations, extravagant experiences, and unparalleled indulgence. Whether one is a seasoned jet setter or daydreaming of the next lavish getaway, the Luxury Travelers Podcast has it all covered. So buckle up and prepare for a journey into the lap of luxury. Now, your host.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is when you're finally getting around to watching this version of our Luxury Travelers Podcast. I have a very, very special guest, and you'll understand why he's so special as we get through this topic. I actually met Saliba Danho at an industry conference in the Bahamas about 3 weeks ago. And he comes from a very unique perspective, and that is tours in the Holy Land. And whether you've ever been or whether you haven't been, I want you to watch this entire show because you're going to learn some things, because he lives right in the heart of Jerusalem. So, Saliba, welcome to the show.
Greetings from Jerusalem, Rodney. Pleasure being with you.
It's a pleasure to have you. When we met 3 weeks ago, I don't know if you remember or not, but I sat down at your table there at the show, and I said, I have to ask you a couple of questions first. And the first question is, are you Christian, are you Jewish, or are you Muslim? Because I wanted to know, especially coming from that holy city, which direction you were coming from.
Well, I'm a proud Christian. My family have been Christian for the last 2,000 years. In the Old Testament, my family is mentioned by the name of Arameans, like when you hear about Jacob saying, my father was a wandering Aramean. So that's actually my ancestry. And my mother tongue is Aramaic, so back home we speak Aramaic, the language which was spoken by Jesus, and the language which was spoken in Galilee 2,000 years ago. And right in the first century AD, back in Damascus and Antioch, that's actually where they basically heard the message and converted to Christianity. And we were the first ones which were called Syria, which means elevated. And from there comes the name Christians. So proudly saying, we were the first ones to be called Christians in the first century AD, all the way back from Antioch.
Wow.
Nowadays, my church is known as the Church of Antioch or the Syriac Orthodox Church. So that's my background. Born and grew up in Jerusalem, in the Old City, right above the tomb of Jesus, right on the rooftop of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So always, I just kind of joke, say, oh, you know what, in my basement, I have the empty tomb of Jesus.
And it is empty for sure. Those of us who believe in Jesus Christ know that the tomb is definitely empty. I got chill bumps all over me just as you were talking about that. But your company's very interesting because I guess at least for the current time, you're pretty much unemployed in Jerusalem, right?
Well, we're almost, I would say, at zero work.
Yeah.
So, yep, ever since that terrible day, October 7th, 2023, all right, tourism basically dropped down almost to zero. There are some courageous travelers who would like to still come and walk on the footsteps of Jesus. But if I would put it this way, the pilgrims of nowadays, all right, are not the same that those who traveled 1,000 years ago, knowing that their chances of going back home alive is 50%. I think today they want to guarantee 100% we want to go back home.
Yeah, exactly. Well, being there in the Holy Land and seeing what's going on, and you and I coming from a very, very similar perspective as far as what our beliefs are, we know at least have some good idea as to what's coming and what's about to happen in the tribulation period in particular. And being right there in Jerusalem, I guess you guys could use 3.5 years of peace. I don't know.
Well, we surely need it. I mean, I'm almost 54 years old. I don't remember a year, okay, which was not, let's say, quite full of different events and incidents. And if you would have, let's say, asked me around 20 years ago, Okay, do you think that the end of days are coming soon, the War of Armageddon? And I said, you know what? No, this is all symbolic. Okay, but nowadays, the way that things are unwrapping right before our eyes and seeing how fast things are developing. Okay, it's just amazing. I mean, if you would have came 20 years ago, there used to be, let's say, around 20 to maybe 100 people of the Jewish people who would be going up to the Temple Mount and talk about rebuilding the temple. Most of the Jewish rabbis are anti-rebuilding the temple because they believe that the destruction of it was a punishment from God and it will not be rebuilt till the coming of the Jewish Messiah, not to confuse it with the Christian Messiah, because we're talking about two different messiahs when it comes all the way to the two different religions. But nowadays, not only that the issue of the rebuilding of the temple is in the Israeli educational curriculum, all right, but you're talking about tens of thousands of people who are sending up all the way to the Temple Mount every year, and minding, of course, that they cannot go all the way up to where the Holy of the Holies would have stood, because in general, the Jewish people are seen as unclean. And to be able to get purified, they need the sacrifice of the red heifer. And for years, they were trying to look for the red heifers. And finally, all right, four of them made it all the way from the Midwest in the USA into Israel. For the first time ever, animals would come into Israel without being quarantined. And they're already 2 years old. And they're without any blemish and without any white hairs, nothing. Pure red heifers waiting to be sacrificed on the Mount of Olives, which could take place at any time. Things
Wow.
are unwrapping really quick before our eyes.
And you talked about two messiahs. It's really not two messiahs. It's the same Jesus Christ. It's just that the majority of the Jewish people did not recognize him as the Messiah when he came.
Absolutely. So we're actually looking forward for the second coming of Jesus. They're looking for the first coming of the Messiah. But when you come all the way to what we believe, all right, the Messiah who will be appearing even for the Jewish people and the salvation of the Jewish people would be actually the same Messiah, Jesus Christ. Even when you go to the book of Revelation, chapter 12, and it talks about the 12,000 Jews who would be saved, all right, multiplied by the 12 tribes of Israel. Interesting, if you take these numbers and multiply them together, it gets you to 16 million people. And if you go today to the number of the Jewish people living in the world, there are about 16 million people. I mean, so these numbers are not even symbolic. For many years, people thought that these numbers are symbolic, but when you do the math, it is 16 million people to be saved. That is the whole Jewish people.
Wow. I'd always heard it was 144,000, but somehow you're doing different math than I am.
Yeah, because it is 144,000, but when you multiply them, okay, back you get all the way to the 16 million. So it
Okay.
is 12 by 12 equal 144,000. Then you multiply them by 12, all right, and you go all the way to basically 16 million people when you add the math.
Okay, so you specialize in doing really a deep dive into the Holy Lands, in particular, with an emphasis on the footsteps of Jesus. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about that? Because there's coming a time when I think they may feel safe enough to come to Israel, and they will be there at they'll be there at a definite historic time in history.
You know, the early fathers of the church, talking about the second up to the fourth century AD, for example, Eusebius, who's considered to be the historian of the church, he called the Holy Land the fifth gospel. He called the Holy Land the fifth gospel. So we have the four gospels, or which usually I would prefer to say there are actually four chapters, okay, in the Bible, rather than four gospels, because when you say gospel, it sounds like each one of them is a Bible by itself. No, there are four gospels, each one of them is a chapter, okay, they actually complete one another. But to understand that, all right, you need to indulge and dive into the fifth gospel. And the fifth gospel is basically the land itself. I mean, just try to think about it that you're walking on the seashores of the Sea of Galilee. And over there, you can just see farmers, even up to today, they go on cultivating their land. They can pick up the seeds and they go on casting up the seeds in the ground. And some of them would be falling into fertile soil. Some of them would be falling all the way on the side of the road. Some of them amid the thistles. All right. And then you can go all the way down and start recalling the parables that were taught by Jesus. They just come live right in front of your eyes over there. Or if you come, let's say, to usually, most of the visitors who comes to Holy Land, Israel, they would be landing nearby Tel Aviv, all right, at what we call today Ben Gurion Airport. And not long time ago, they used to call it Lod Airport, which is the ancient city of Lydda. And that's what we hear in the book of Acts about Peter, all right, healing a paralytic at the city or the town of Lydda. And from there, he goes to Joppa. Today, you land in Ben Gurion Airport, you head to Tel Aviv, which is known as Tel Aviv Joppa. And that's around 8 miles as the crow flies from one place to another, which is more or less like a one-day walking distance in ancient times. And that's where Peter makes it later on to Joppa, and that's where he would bring back Tabitha back to life. So Tabitha Kumi in Arabic, which means Tabitha, young girl, get up. And then he goes all the way on the rooftop of the house of Simon the Tanner, and that's where he has a vision. And a big basket, full of different types of animals, reptiles, okay, within that net. And the voice tells him within that basket, the voice tells him, kill and eat. And the answer which he will say, Lord, this is not kosher. And the voice answered back, nothing that the hands of God have made is clean or unclean. That means the word came for all nations. So you're standing over there in Joppa looking at the ancient city, 5,000 years old city, and then from there overlooking Tel Aviv, all right, the modern city of Tel Aviv, which was the first Hebrew city, all right, to be rebuilt in the modern times, all right, in the state of Israel, to be the nucleus. And in a way, despite the fact that officially Jerusalem is the capital, but Tel Aviv, in effect, is considered to be the economical capital. It's like New York in the USA, right? And so you're looking from ancient Joppa, you're looking at modern Tel Aviv, and that is just the beginning of your journey when you're venturing into the Holy Land. And then traveling along the coastal line, going all the way to Caesarea Maritima, that beautiful ancient Roman city. You visit over there the ruins of what used to be either the largest port on the shores of the Mediterranean 2,000 years ago, or one of the three largest, together with that of Alexandria and Athens. And just over there, you start hearing about Augustus Caesar. You start hearing about Peter, baptizing the first Gentile. You hear about Paul giving the first defense of the church. So if you're coming as a Christian to the Holy Land, all right, Joppa and Caesarea will show you the place from where Christianity was sent all the way to the Gentiles. And then you go from there to Mount Carmel. And the most interesting thing that when you're traveling to Mount Carmel, you pass by all these olive trees. And then you can see some of the wild olive trees, and right next to them, some of the cultivated olive trees. And Paul, all right, in Romans, he talks about, okay, Christianity to be brought all the way to the Jewish people as well as to the Gentiles. And he compares them to an olive tree. The Jewish people will be the wild olive tree, while the Gentiles will be the cultivated one. And obviously, in many cases, the wild one will give you better fruits, all right, than the one which is cultivated. And you're there at Mount Carmel, overlooking the Valley of Armageddon. I mean, you're seeing Nazareth from a distance. You're at the spot where we had the encounter between Elijah the prophet and the prophets of Baal. You're looking over the modern port of Haifa, the ancient port of Akko, all the way into Phoenicia, into Lebanon nowadays. And just you're looking at the Valley of Armageddon, and with all the events which took place along that valley during the Old Testament and later on also along the New Testament era, I mean, it is God's playground. I mean, just imagine you're standing overlooking God's playground, one of the most important ancient highways of the ancient world. And at that spot, that's where you can see the past, that's where you look into the present, and that's where you can see the future, right before your eyes. I mean, there's no place, in my opinion, on the surface of this planet that could rival that one, before getting all the way to Nazareth to see the place where the Word became flesh and where Jesus grew up at. And just the beginning, I mean, you're only unscratching the ground. And along the same time, if we talk about modern travelers, all right, there's nothing wrong about stopping at one of the boutique vineyards, all right, and wineries along the valley over there for some wine tasting, or visiting a spice farm to go on and dip your hands into some of these herbs which grew up in that land over the last 5,000 years.
So what's a typical day on one of your tours encompass? I know when I was there 7 or 8 years ago, our guide was a Christian journalist that lives in Jerusalem, and he took us up to the Mount of Olives because from there you can look into the holy city, and he pointed out all the places he was going to be taking us that day. How do you lead your groups, or how do your group leaders take their groups and start their journey in particular through Jerusalem and the rest of the Holy Land?
Well, usually, as I mentioned before, the tours would start usually at the coastal line. So if the arrival time is early, because many times the flights would come from North America around 10 o'clock in the morning, so till check in at the hotel around 3 p.m., that gives you some time. So interesting that many of the tour guides, all right, would choose, even though it's not part of the trip then, but they still have some time, okay, to do something before they get the people to the hotel. And obviously the people, they're jet lagged, they're tired. So they take them to the Valley of Elah. And that's the place where we had the encounter between David and Goliath. So just driving all the way along the Shephelah Plains, these are like plains around 300 feet above sea level at the foots of the hills of Judea. You're just not far away from where David used to take and tend his sheep. When we hear about David fighting a lion, that would have been the area where David would have actually been encountering the lions. So then you go from there to the coastal line along the Valley of Armageddon. You spend a couple of days in Galilee, all right, visiting the sites around the Sea of Galilee. You might want to go up to the Golan Heights. Now, it all depends also if the trips are just, the age of the people who are on the trip. I mean, you can obviously do it as a biblical tour. You can do it as a historical tour because the Holy Land, even though it is a pilgrimage land where pilgrims would be coming, but when it comes all the way to culture, I mean, we talk about a country which was invaded by almost every ancient civilization, okay, throughout history, all the way from ancient Egypt, all the way up to the British in the 20th century. So there was not one single superpower that have not left their fingerprints over the land. So whatever you're looking for, from Egyptian temples all the way to Greek, Roman cities, if you would like to look at it from a religious point of view, whether you're a Jew or a Christian, or even for Muslims who consider the Holy Land to be the third holiest grounds as well. So you travel around the Sea of Galilee, then all the way down toward the ancient city of Jericho. Nearby it, you have the place where the Israelites would have crossed into the Promised Land, right at the foot of the mountains of Moab in Jordan. If you're traveling along the Jordanian borders. And let me remind you that when you talk about the Holy Land, the whole country from the north to the south is about 250 miles long. So that means if you decide to drive it, you can actually drive it all in one day, cross it from one point to another, from the north all the way to the south. So, and then from there, when you're in Jericho, like around 750 feet below sea level, not to mention the nearby Dead Sea, all right, and remember one thing, the Dead Sea, when you come to it, it's not only floating on the Dead Sea, which is famous for its minerals, and today we call the Sea of Life because it is a reviving sea when you come to look at it from a medical point of view or from beauty point of view, but also some historical places like Metzada, for example, the last stronghold against the Romans, when you talk about Ein Gedi, where David hid from King Saul. And I think the most interesting is Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, which is, I mean, I always say God has a good sense of humor because in 1947, God did not use a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian, okay, for to be, let's say, a tool into that discovery. He chosen a Muslim by the name of Muhammad, all right, who would be the one looking for his goats, throwing a rock, all right, and leading up to the greatest discovery, biblical discovery of the 20th century, when we have found copies of all the books of the Old Testament right at Qumran, at the very same time, all right, when Israel would be reborn again. And then you start your journey from 1,340 feet below sea level, that's the level of the Dead Sea, all the way up to Jerusalem. And yes, you get all the way to Jerusalem, to the Mount of Olives, and there lies before your eyes, okay, the eternal golden city of Jerusalem. And obviously, the first view, the first building which dominates the scene will be the Dome of the Rock, okay, building which is almost 1,300 years old, considered to be the third most important shrine for the Muslim world. But that is literally the spot where Abraham, okay, brought his son Isaac to sacrifice him at. That's where the first and the second temple were stood. Okay, that's where actually, if you look at Jesus' ministry, you're on the Mount of Olives. And it's basically between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, where most of Jesus' ministry was focused at. And then right behind it, right behind the Golden Dome, there's another dome equal in size, just at an upper hill, or of a black color, which is that of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that would be the place where Jesus was crucified at, and that's where he was buried at, and where he resurrected at on the third day. And from there, you look, wherever you look over the city, you can see where it started at. You can see where David built his city. You can see the city which was taken over by Solomon. You can see the city which was ruled by the 20 kings of Judea. You can see the spot where Solomon put his temple, the extension up to Mount Zion. You're looking at the spot where David's tomb is. You look at the place where Jesus ate his Last Supper. Then you can see, even though it is nestled amid the alleys of the old city, you can see the Via Dolorosa, the route that Jesus walked carrying his cross all the way from the Antonia Fortress where he stood before Caiaphas, all the way up to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So the whole old city, 242 acres, 1/6 of it is the Temple Mount, is just lying there before your eyes, reminding that you're standing on the Mount of Olives. Right below you have the Kidron Valley, the Valley of the Judgment, as it is called by Joel the prophet, and the Eastern Gate. And the fascinating thing is, when you look at the Eastern Gate, Christians, Jews, and Muslims believe that this is where the Messiah is going to sit at and judge all the nations.
Yeah, it's amazing. I remember as we were walking through Jerusalem, and we were there for 3 days. The first day we had a Christian guide, and we came up on this. I don't remember how big it was, but I want to say 8 feet tall menorah that was in a plexiglass case. And our guide told us that that was for the new temple when it was built. And of course, he and we concurred on where that location would be based on scripture. 2 days later, we had a Jewish guide, and he told us the same thing, that it had been donated by a businessman, and it would be placed in the new temple, but no one knows where that is. And when I tried to tell him where that was, we got into a huge argument, because I told him it's going to be where the Dome of the Rock is, and he had a really hard time swallowing that.
Well, if you really look at it, Muslims, the Muslims, they call Jerusalem Al-Quds, which literally means the Holy of the Holies. And when they built the Golden Dome, they literally, in my opinion, they have literally put it over where the Holy of the Holies have stood. Actually, there's even, I don't know if you have been up to the Temple Mount, but when you go up to the Temple Mount, you can still visit the esplanade of the temple over there. And right before the Golden Dome, toward the east, there's a smaller dome, which is known as the Dome of the Chain. And they say that this was actually the treasury, or rather the Islamic periods, or it was a small model, crafted before the building of the Golden Dome. And that little chapel or little mosque is literally standing where the main altar of the temple, has stood still. So if you are actually to stand in front of the Golden Dome and you have that Dome of the Chain in front of you, literally 30 to 40 feet away from it, that's where that golden menorah is to stand. That's where it stood 2,000 years ago. It used to be 1 out of 10 2,000 years ago. The only difference is 2,000 years ago, it used to be pure gold. Nowadays, it's actually silver plated gold. But if you ever go to Rome and you see Titus Arch over there, and on Titus Arch, it shows you actually the slaves, the Jewish slaves Jews taken to slavery, carrying up the Holy Menorah with an octagonal base. That menorah, which is today sitting in the Jewish quarter, actually nowadays they have just moved it to the stairway which leads down to the Wailing Wall. So it overlooks, so if you stand looking at it today, you can see the menorah, and through the plexiglass, you can see the Wailing Wall and the Golden Dome right behind it. And it's basically a copy of the way it is described up in the Torah. When you look all the way at the oil holders, the petals which are presenting over their almond petals. And, like the prophet Jeremiah, he compares the light of the Lord to almond blossoms. So the petals which goes around the oil holders, that's actually out of symbolize the almond blossoms.
So people are fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament, and they're not even aware of it, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely. Next door to, not far away actually from where the menorah is, we do have the Temple Institute. Like a couple of days ago, we had Yom Kippur, and you've been to the Wailing Wall, and you've been to the men's side of the Wailing Wall,
Right.
all right? And if you are actually to be facing the Wailing Wall, looking at the left corner, which would be the northern,
Okay.
western
Right.
corner of the Wailing Wall, right above it, there's actually like a small building, which is dating back to the Middle Ages, and usually it's occupied by military personnel, except one day a year, right after the end of Yom Kippur, there's actually Rabbi Goren. All right, his grandfather was actually the rabbi who walked up the Temple Mount right after the 6 Days War. And on that day, he actually asked General Rabin at that time to knock down. He said, "Knock down the Golden Dome. We're just at it right now, and let's rebuild the temple." All right, and then of course Rabin and Moshe Dayan said, "No, no, 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 this cannot be done." Okay, this cannot be done. But every year, right on the eve of Yom Kippur, they actually get into that small room, and that will be the closest to them to get to where the Holies would have stood, and they do the Nidira prayer. So that is the family which established the Temple Institute. They're responsible for crafting many vessels which are to be used at the new temple, at the third temple. And yes, they are preparing for that. It just, I don't think they know the purpose, or
Right.
that, or maybe they don't know that they are actually the instrument, all right, in basically fulfilling the prophecies which has to do with the end of the world. I mean, the ones which were talking about by the prophet Ezekiel or the prophet Zechariah or the book of Revelation.
Okay, we've got a couple more minutes here. And before we got started, you and I got in this conversation about something that happened very recently on the steps of Mount Moriah, on the steps of the Dome of the Rock, where the rabbi actually went up those steps. Can you tell us, just
Well,
relive that for
actually,
us?
all right, let's actually go back to around 3 months ago, all right,
Okay.
which is actually on what they call Tisha B'Av, all right, and that is the day when the Jews commemorate the destruction of the first and the destruction of the second temple. On that day, by the Eastern Gate, all right, and led, of course, by the Ministry of National Security, as they call him today. Used to be the Minister of Interior, but now they changed the name. So for the first time ever, you actually have seen Jews praying publicly on the Temple Mount by the Eastern Gate. Still minding, they're not going up to the platform where the Holy of the Holies stood because they're not considered to be pure yet. And just on Yom Kippur, a couple of days ago, for the first time ever, okay, there's a guy who had been selected and educated to serve as a priest at the Temple of Jerusalem, fully dressed in his linen garment, literally following up the description which we have in the Torah, how Aaron and his household should be dressed up when they walk all the way up to the temple, fully dressed, okay, in priesthood clothing or dressing, walking up to the Temple Mount. All right, and that just happened a couple of days ago on Yom Kippur.
Folks, if you're watching this and you're still watching this, you have to understand that, uh, at least from where I sit, and I've read the Old and New Testament multiple times all the way through, and Saliba is living that scripture, has lived that scripture, his family for generations. And what's happening right now in the city of Jerusalem, in the country of Israel, you have to want to know more. And this man right here and his people are the people that can not only show you more, but would be thrilled to show you more as soon as it's safe to travel to his country.
God willing.
God willing, yes. Amen. And so,
Well,
Saliba, I could sit here and talk with you all afternoon, but we try to keep these at 30 minutes so they're palatable for people. But folks, I know you're going to want to know more after you watch this. So drop us a note, give us a call, and we'll keep you posted on when and if the all clear is given so that we can return back and you can experience what I've experienced myself and what Saliba lives on a daily basis. Saliba, I can't think of anybody I'd rather have to show me around your country and your city than you. And I'm so grateful and thankful. Uh, that God had our paths to cross in Nassau 3 weeks ago, and you had the time to be on the show. I appreciate you. I love you, brother, and
Thank you, brother.
Godspeed.
We'll look forward to welcome you back in Israel.
Okay.
You and your guest, anytime, just when it comes down, we'll give the signal. Let's pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and we'll be more than glad just to take you around and show you around.
Excellent.
Thank you, Rodney.
So, folks, as I always say, enjoy yourself. It's later than you think. And today, later than you think takes on a whole new definition. That's it for today.
Thanks for joining us on the Luxury Travelers Podcast. For more information, head on over to luxurytravelerspodcast.com to connect with our team or leave us a message. Until next time, safe travels and savor the extraordinary.